We have Nani here tonight. So welcome and go right ahead.
Commissioner Boland,
Here.
Commissioner Felt,
Here.
Councilmember Griswold. Here. Commissioner Hull,
Here.
Commissioner Kleinman,
Here.
Commissioner Lernahan.
Here.
Commissioner Parsons,
Here.
Commissioner Sanderson, Commissioner Summers,
Here.
Commissioner Woods, Sergeant Bill Clock,
Here.
Commissioner Dolan,
Here.
Commissioner Hess,
Here.
Commissioner Lazarus,
Here.
Commissioner Margolis, Commissioner Webb. We have a quorum, and Linda Diane will now introduce our new Commissioner, Jim Summers.
All right. So I think we have one vacancy left, and so we had a vacancy for a transportation business owner that was open for quite some time, and Jim Summers has agreed to take that position. And so if you want to just say a sentence or two about your interest in transportation, and you can mention your business.
Okay,
That's allowed. That would be great, and then you'll get to know us as time goes by.
okay. Well, my name is Jim Summers, and along with my wife, Kim May, we own HEH Human Electric Hybrid and Urban Rider and Congo Bike, both of which stores that sell both electric and a few acoustic bicycles. One avid rider. We put thousands of miles a year on bike. And Linda and I had a discussion, and we thought this would be not only helpful, but fun and informative. We've ridden bikes all over the world and big cities. So we've seen a little bit about what that looks like in other places.
Great, thanks for being willing to serve.
Yeah.
For all of us for being willing to serve, actually. Okay, and we have a consent agenda to approve, if you've read the minutes and the agenda as it stands. Okay, seconded by? Kleinman. All right. All those in favor, say aye. 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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we have an agenda and minutes. We would like to invite people to have public comment now. You have 3 minutes, which will be timed by Nani. Is there anybody here who'd like to speak? All right.
Good evening again. My name is Clark Chernetsky. And on October 17th, 1839, the first train arrived in Ann Arbor. That was 180 years ago, tomorrow. And we've had continuous railroad passenger service ever since. This was just about, I think, 15 years from the time that Ann Arbor was founded. So it's been a big part of the history. It did arrive in Ypsilanti a year and a half before that. That's because it's kind of a straight shot out of Detroit. But once you get to Ypsilanti, then you have to contend with the Huron Valley. For example, the railroad crosses the Huron River between Ypsilanti and Dexter 15 times. Now back then they didn't cross quite as often because they followed the river. If you go out Huron River Drive west of town, a lot of that follows the old railroad track. Also, I'd like to mention that in June we had a presentation about positive contrast lighting for lighting of crosswalks. And when repairs were made to fix a severed power line by my house, that's the crosswalk across Nixon at Clegg School. It was done right. They moved one of the lights a little further north. They put a new one a little bit to the north. So now you have about 25 feet from the crosswalk, a street light on the approach so that pedestrians can be easily seen. If you want to see a good example of it, go out there some night. Also, the Traverwood reconstruction is almost done. They have one layer of asphalt to put on one side and to paint it. If you go out there, you can see how they've cut down that steep embankment that used to be right along by the library there. So people now would be able to get up or down it at ease. So thanks city for that and for the street light. And thank people for taking the train all these years. Goodbye.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? All right, then the public hearing part is closed, and we have business. And the first order of business is the transit zoning district update.
Good evening, Commission. My name is Brett Leonard. I'm the planning manager for the city of Ann Arbor. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you a concept that we have been working on. This is a proposed new zoning district that we are proposing for addition to our Unified Development Code. I'm going to give you an overview of why we're working on it, some of the particulars of what we're proposing as part of it, and would be happy to answer any questions at the end or even during the presentation if something you would like a clarification on anything. This ordinance has had one public hearing at the Planning Commission. It has not yet been recommended by the Planning Commission, but they gave staff some feedback that we are continuing to work on, so I anticipate it coming back to them at some point in the near future with some of those changes, and would welcome any feedback from you this evening, as well as certainly, whether it's this evening or at a future meeting, your consideration of endorsement of this proposed district. So over a decade, we have enacted numerous master plan policies, and as the Transportation Commission, I know that you're aware, these policy documents are a way that we engage the community on a very open and broad basis and wide-ranging basis to hear their ideas and thoughts about what we want to see our community, how we want to see our community evolve, what we've learned from our past experience, and what goals and objectives we would like to achieve in the future. The sustainability framework in 2013 is a great culling together of a lot of this past work. The proposed zoning district, we believe, is directly supportive of the climate and energy, community, land use and access, and resource management goals of that document. And then a more substantial language and policy is identified in the 2009 land use element. This document is our land use plan, where we establish our future land use map, a lot of goals and objectives for this. Specifically, we identify that we want Ann Arbor to become a place where land use and transportation decisions are successfully integrated, and that we want to encourage uses on the same site or in the same building to encourage more pedestrian activity, to promote vitality, shared parking opportunities, and a variety of housing choices. That document takes it a step further and talks about reducing parking, trying to specifically support office or residential in upper stories above commercial centers, all towards establishing really vibrant retail village centers and commercial centers in the city that perform in a more future and forward-looking way than perhaps the last century of land use planning, where we sort of unfortunately got away from some of that mixed-use goals. Specifically, the land use plan identifies 3 goals that are directly attributable to this district: promoting land use designs that reduce reliance on the automobile, to provide a full range of housing choices, and to encourage commercial and employment centers that promote pedestrian activity and de-emphasize the use of the automobile. The work program of that 2009 master plan identifies a series of highest priority goals, developing regulatory incentives such as density bonuses for developments that provide affordable housing units, and revising our code to reduce minimum and specify maximum setbacks and build-to provide a really positive interaction between private land uses and our transportation networks. Also in the Transportation Master Plan update, this is from 2009, obviously going under consideration of review right now, but further emphasizes the opportunity for looking at a district like this, promoting a transportation system supportive of and integrated with land use decisions, and embracing a philosophy that our goals to improve safety, reduce emissions are going to come not from widening streets, but by alternative and creative transportation policies and investments in our community. The Transportation Master Plan specifically has some land use recommendations, updating the recommendations in the master plan to support increased density and mixed land uses and signature transit corridors, creating a transit-oriented development overlay district for signature corridors. That's about right at hitting the nail on the head of what I'm going to present to you this evening. And then incorporating in the zoning ordinance form-based regulations that support and encourage transit and active transportation options as opposed to over-reliance on automobiles. Unsurprisingly, the non-motorized plan from 2013 furthers these goals as well. Specifically talks again about those commercial corridors, looking for opportunities to move away from an automotive-based design, getting away from large expanses of parking to provide more options and opportunity and positive experience for multiple modes and users of our transportation system. Goes on, the non-motorized plan puts, I think, a great stake in the ground and says that we should aspire to eliminate the segregation of commercial and housing areas. It should be noted that right now in our zoning, we allow for this to occur. In all of our commercial districts, we allow mixed uses. But this proposed transit-oriented district would take this decade plus of public input and policy statements that I've just summarized and take that a step further to start requiring that we achieve that mixed use and integration of land use on a property by property basis. So we propose to do that by creating a new T1 transit support district. We think it's a little bit incremental towards being transit supportive as opposed to a true transit-oriented development district. We are not proposing to rezone any property right now. At this point, we're proposing to create this district so that it's a tool. The next phase of that conversation would be to determine where it's appropriate and, at a minimum, to provide it for developers to seek to use it as a tool to accomplish their goals in the appropriate places in the city. We relied heavily on a lot of our existing standards in the ordinance. We looked at permitted uses like our D2 and C3 district. Our D2 is our downtown interface district. That's sort of the district around the downtown core that sort of stepped from the highest density core of the city into the surrounding neighborhoods. The C3 district is our automotive-oriented commercial corridors. Many of these zoning districts are on the signature transit corridors identified in the current transportation plan. We relied on our office district to look at placement standards. The thing we liked about the office district is it provides quite a bit of flexibility for density and area height and placement but it also provides some protection from adjacent residential uses. That is, it provides a lot of flexibility when you're away from residential, and as you get closer to them, they become more restrictive in height and setback requirements. We use form-based standards like our D1, D2, and character districts throughout some of our downtown and D2 cores. This is trying to achieve the physical form of buildings that we think are going to further the goals of multimodal transportation success, and use specific standards to make sure that we're focusing on the details that we hope to be successful in achieving the goals as well. This is the intent statement. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. To nerd out from a planning perspective, intent statements are intended to communicate the goal of a zoning district. We look at this when there's sort of a question of interpretation of some of the more substantive details of the zoning district. But it is important to make sure we're clearly articulating what our vision is to accomplish with this district. Permitted uses, as I indicated, are the same as our D2 and C3. This is providing a wide range of commercial and service uses and office uses. However, we're specifically going away from the automobile-oriented uses, specifically not including automobile sales, automobile repair, fueling stations, wholesale operations, warehouses, and no drive-through facilities are proposed to be permitted in this zoning district. getting into some of that form and that step forward as far as mixed use, this district would require mixed use. That is, a minimum of half of the property, of the area of the development would have to be devoted to residential, and no more than 66%. So somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the development is going to have to be residential. That other half is going to have to be commercial, office, meet some of the other goals of that mixed-use category. You could achieve this on multiple buildings on the same site, but it has to be harmonious. It has to both meet some of the design intentions that you'll see as we get into here shortly. The building design has to be, or it has to be at least, you'll see it when we get into the area height and placement, it has to be at least a 2-story building. 75% of the second floor, or at least 75% of the first floor has to be covered by a second floor, so you don't get any sort of like faux second-story facades. The first floor has to have a minimum of 15 feet in height. This replicates a standard in our downtown cores, and it's really intended to recognize that we want to create flexibility in those first floor uses to evolve over time, be it commercial, be it office, and providing the physical space for any sort of pertinent mechanical systems that might be required to be able to allow that flexibility in use. Buildings must be at least 80% of the lot width. We want a positive pedestrian, non-motorized experience. Again, what you saw, a lot of the goals, we don't want these expanses of parking along these transit routes, so it's encouraging a density of physicality so it feels very comfortable and pedestrian-oriented as you're experiencing the corridors. That is furthered by requiring transparency. A minimum of 60% of the first floor has to be transparent with windows and doors. When you think about your most positive pedestrian experiences in communities, they often have that interaction between the private and public spaces, and that transparency is really important to help accomplish that, as opposed to sort of a more fortress-feeling kind of blank wall. We're sort of replicating centuries of design that seem to suggest that storefront windows work really well for pedestrian-oriented design, so we're requiring that windows be no more than 3 feet off the ground. Buildings have to have a functional entrance door facing the street. It's not to say the buildings couldn't have entrances elsewhere, but you have to have that accessibility off of the transportation corridor into the use to encourage that connection and utility. That could be accomplished, though, through lobbies, shared entrances, but there has to be some mechanism right off the street into it. No sort of faux doors that sort of appear like the front of the building, but rely on a sort of a rear automobile-oriented access. These are probably the most likely to evolve at this point, or among the likely to evolve. We're trying to set the expectation that there's a prioritization. You have to accommodate all forms of transportation when considering the layout of these sites, and you have to invest in the type of amenities and site design features to achieve that, whether that's amenities, benches, wider sidewalks, plazas. We really want attention paid to how you're successfully achieving that outcome. You'll see this language and some of the subsequent language which emphasizes that the pedestrian non-motorized shall take precedence over the vehicular transportation to these sites. I think that there's probably an opportunity to sort of to improve the specificity of this language. I think this language right here is stronger in its intent. I would like it to evolve so we can be a little bit more measured in how we evaluate a site to say whether or not that's been achieved or not. We attempt to do that by identifying that, for example, if in order to success the non-motorized access, it means reducing driveways, that prioritization will occur. I'd like to see this evolve probably into some numeric standards, but we'll see where we get with that. Off-street parking. We are changing our approach to off-street parking for these districts, again, trying to emphasize the connection to the transit system and the non-motorized system. While in most of our mixed-use districts, we require parking at a rate of 1 space per dwelling unit, we're proposing that there's no minimum parking is required for these. You could develop it, all your dwelling units without any supportive parking, and have it totally rely on non-motorized or public transit systems, and up to a maximum of half a space per dwelling unit. So we are taking away the floor, and we're lowering the cap for these residential units that are intended to be, again, directly on top of these transit corridors. Non-residential floor area, I would say there's a little bit more flexibility. Again, we're not putting any minimum requirement, but we're putting a cap based on the land uses identified in our current zoning ordinance that says you can't go above those limits. Some of the dimensional standards again, are pulling from some of our other districts. There is no FAR limit being proposed, the floor area ratio. Just to be clear, floor area ratio, if you think about a lot and you build that lot from corner to corner at 1 story, that's 100% FAR. 2 stories is 200% FAR, and so forth. Some of our districts do place limits. We're not proposing such a limit in this circumstance. To the proposed dedication of space to non-motorized circulation, we are requiring a 25% open space requirement. That doesn't necessarily have to be natural. It could be plaza, but it has to be open space dedicated to circulation on the site. We are proposing that it can be no more than 10 feet from the road corridor, so it has that proximity to the transportation options. And then the setbacks and the height are where we're relying largely on our precedent of the office district. In both cases, in the case of height, there's no height limit unless you get within 300 feet of a residential district, and then it's a minimum of 30 feet plus an additional foot for every height the building exceeds 55 feet, I think. And then as it relates to, that's setbacks. And then as it relates to height, no height is proposed if it's more than 300 feet from a residential district. And if it is within 300 feet of a residential district, could not exceed 80 feet in height. And then no minimum lot area requirements and no lot width requirements. So as long as you can program and achieve the goals on the site, we're not specifying that it has to be a certain size. Again, we're not proposing to actually rezone any property to this, but our initial thoughts are that this would be appropriate along transit corridors. It could have varying quote-unquote encroachment off of that corridor, but a common theme is it's going to have frontage on that transportation corridor in order to achieve the goal. So we wouldn't see it being stacked behind property. It could be part of a larger development, but it's going to be really important that it has that direct connection to the transit corridor. Just for preliminary analysis, these are some of the areas that we think would be good to start with, to consider to start with. This is the South State and West Eisenhower area. The red indicates potential areas for this zoning to be applied, and then the dotted line within that would be those areas that would potentially not have a height limit as proposed under this scenario. This is the South State and Eisenhower target area as well. All of this area would be more than 300 feet from residential, so potentially could be considered for T1 zoning and would not have any height under the current parameters. And then this is Washtenaw. Washtenaw Avenue, obviously, the city has partnered and done a lot of work with the Reimagine corridor, a lot of investment in the opportunities along this corridor. This corridor has a lot more proximity to residential areas, so you can see the potential area of potential T1 zoning is much larger than the potential unlimited height area based on some of those factors of neighboring land uses. So that's what I got. I'm happy to answer any questions. Generally, I would say I would anticipate some changes to this draft from what you're seeing this evening. Some of the feedback that we've gotten so far are we've received a lot of positive feedback along the lines of it's about damn time that we've moved in this direction. But we've also definitely received some criticism that we haven't done enough engagement on this proposed standard, that it's over relying on just increasing supply to help with our affordability issues in the city as opposed to a more direct affordable housing requirement. And we've also heard concerns that we don't really have a robust enough transit system in order to support this kind of prototype of development. So again, happy to answer any questions and go from there.
So we do have the time for questions, and there's also the potential for a actual motion, which could be done tonight, but we could also wait till next month if you want. So, yes.
Hi, thanks very much for this. It's really interesting. So you said a couple times you're not planning to rezone any property. Can you just, that confuses me a little bit because most of these corridors I thought was already occupied. And so what would the impact of this proposal be?
So we've had a lot of discussions internally and with the Planning Commission about how to approach this. And I think there is quite a bit of complexity to not only putting together the zoning district and what the requirements look like, And then the next step about, when you look at the city, whether it's these corridors or other corridors, where is it appropriate to do so? And so the way we're approaching this is to create a zoning district that, if adopted, there would not be a single property zoned in the city T1 at the time of adoption. However, that suddenly becomes a tool so that, one, if a petitioner is looking at adding development to a site, redeveloping a site in one of these areas, we can have that conversation with them, well, we have this other tool available. That's not to say we can't also then start the next phase of this conversation to say, we have this zoning district in place, now it's time to start looking at how we want to add it and have it achieve the results we want. That could happen in a couple of different ways. One of the things you saw in one of the plan references was the reference to an overlay district. That is one way that we could layer these kind of requirements on existing zoning districts to try to add some additional layers of control. Alternatively, we could have a community conversation, a planning conversation to say, we think that this area should be rezoned to this. And most likely what that's going to mean is that some properties are going to become non-conforming because they don't meet this goal. But that's going to be the most surefire way to ensure that when anything happens there, it is going to be 100% consistent with the goals of these requirements. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions to figure out what is the appropriate level of push-pull incentive versus mandate to put this onto geographies. But the intent was not only to get it as a tool in place so it can be used, but also we're trying hard to structure it so if we start looking to other corridors and we think that it's 90% there, we're trying to structure it in such a way that we can make some minor adjustments to it so it might have applicability to all areas of the city where we think it's appropriate as opposed to starting from over.
Thank you.
Hi, so thank you for this. This is great. I love this. I really hope that we move forward with some more transit-oriented zoning. I have a couple of questions. One of them, this was sort of something you sort of skimmed by, was this idea of 25% open space.
Mhm.
Can you, first of all, go back there, and second of all, explain what that means? So like on any given property, 25% of it has to be
Not have a building on it.
not have a building on it.
Yep.
And where, is that similar to other kinds of zoning districts that we have in the city?
It is. We have open space requirements. They don't tend to be in our downtown districts. In most of our downtown districts where we're looking at, like the D2, for example, we don't have some of those same restrictions. But it comes out of just recognizing that, I think what we're thinking is that when we're talking about transforming some of these corridors, we're not putting a lot of load on parking and the like. I think that there probably is going to be some need for density in order for certainly the first to sort of jump into this prototype, right? If you're going to be the first to build this kind of prototype on Washtenaw, I think there's going to have to be some level of comfort and size, frankly, that you know that it's going to work out. We want to make sure that it doesn't come at the cost of what are the amenities that are really going to make this a desired place. I would say the Planning Commission, when they, at their first reading of this, took that a step further and said, well, maybe we should actually take that a step further and build in some actual true natural open spaces so that we don't end up with over-urbanized areas that are devoid of connections to open space. It's sort of unresolved about how that will manifest. But in short, yes, we have other districts that have an open space requirement, and this is just intended to find an appropriate balance of we want you to be thinking about investing in these amenities so it works not only for the residents but for the customers.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question, the requirements for bicycle amenities were sort of like, see something else,
Yeah.
but I want to know what that,
Sure, they
Yes.
depend on use. When we're requiring those be maintained. So right now we have a variety of bicycle parking requirements that are mandated on a use-by-use basis. They range from, in 3 categories. We have Class A, which is hoops on a sidewalk. We have Class B, which is covered, no, I'm getting this backwards. Class C is hoops on a sidewalk, Class B is covered, and Class A is interior to a building fully enclosed. And so those standards would apply to all these units just as they do to any development now. We're not proposing to increase those. That could be a question that as we're relying more on non-motorized, maybe those should be upped. But at this point, we're just not providing any relaxation of those standards like we are with vehicular parking.
okay, so there's a certain amount of bike parking in each of those classes that would be required?
I can give you the specific ones if you give me a minute to pull
Okay,
it up.
yeah, thanks.
So for multifamily, we require one bike space for each 5 dwelling units, and half of those have to be Class A, which is a bike room or a locker, and half of them have to be Class C. So we're not proposing any changes to those, but we're not providing any exception from them either.
Okay, so I would, in terms of feedback, I would
Yeah.
love to see consideration for increasing the amount of, especially Class A, because if you have residents who are having a bike as their primary mode of transportation, that needs to be secure, it needs to be available to them. I can envision an entire family of 4 where every member of that family is riding a bike to get where they're going. So just, I understand that it's going to vary, but, so I live on one of these corridors, I live on Packard, and I can easily imagine a family existing happily without a car, as long as their bikes are okay.
Gabby?
I can, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard this presentation twice, and I keep learning new things. It's really complex. What I'm wondering is, I definitely agree with the goal and the general criteria. Is there a way to use PUDs to sort of jumpstart this process?
It's certainly possible. The intention with this, I would say, or the benefit of an approach like this is that you are getting to the same benefits without some level of discretion. If I'm a developer and I go through the PUD process, there's a level of discretion that the Planning Commission and City Council has some latitude to decide on the adequacy of the trade-offs for that development. So definitely, we could accomplish that now without adopting this.
I'm
in
just
any way.
wondering, is it going to take 9 months to get it adopted?
These standards?
Yes.
I hope not.
Oh, okay. And my other question is about property values. As soon as this passes, is there going to be a huge increase in property values along these corridors?
When this passes, it won't, but when we start talking about rezoning properties, I think that, yeah, the development potential of those properties might start to shift. I don't know how that will impact values. I think it would be reasonable to assume if this were enacted as it is, an office district right now that has a very similar development potential might not have much change, but going from a C3 to this might have more of a positive impact on property values.
Okay, and even a residential property along the transit corridor could suddenly qualify as a D1?
Not as a D1.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, typically with the D1s, we really the intention of those are our downtown cores. But if there were a residential property along one of these corridors, it could be considered for T1. I think one of the challenges with that is that it might be integrated into a wider residential area often, and the restrictions on the setbacks would probably start minimizing the potential benefit of that site unless you were to assemble multiple properties.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Is your mic on, just so you know how to do that?
Good on?
Yes,
I
it
can't
is.
tell. Okay.
It's green.
Oh, so, just jumping in on the tail end of the resources on the bike. So, statement was made that, every member of a family of 4 could be riding a bike. Then also, things like family cargo bike, when they're 2 or 3 times bigger than a normal bike, and you can have 4 members of a family on a single bike. So that's coming. And the security of bike parking, even if it's only, covered bike parking, it's a little confusing to me as to why I still see things like brand-new bike hoops being put in at Terrytown and then put 10 feet away from, the covering of the farmer's market, and they don't have any covering there at all. And that, it's a rainy day, it's a rainy day, but you don't always, for the people that want to bike to work, let's say, it might be nice in the morning and it's going to rain through the day, it'd be nice to park your bike under something and keep it dry all day rather than come out to something that's really wet.
Yeah, Planning Commission has had quite a bit of discussion on that. For our Class A, a lot of in our particularly residential developments, they're incorporated into bike rooms. The planning commission often has a lot of feedback about, they're often tucked in the basement or something, and it's not very accessible.
right.
And that becomes a barrier, even though it might be a really nice space. If it's too much of a barrier to get your bike down there, you're gonna tend to use the Class C spaces or something. So that's great feedback. I think generally, speaking for the planning, but I think there is sort of thoughts about what are the ratios of that, or what are the standards to make sure that we're achieving the Class A in a more successful way. But I would say there's a lot of conversation supporting your notion that Class B parking can be very valuable to a site.
I'm just going to jump in with it. Thank you. I just want to say I support the mixed-use zones very much. I'm familiar with both of those images, and if you wouldn't mind scrolling to either one, that's fine. My question, and part of this is editorializing, and there's sort of a general question involved. I love the idea of bike parking. I love the idea of prioritizing pedestrians. Washtenaw near Huron happens to be like an island of zero bicycle infrastructure and really limited bicycle or pedestrian connections right now. So, which leads to the general question of, do you, and this might be up beyond the scope of this project, or at least putting this together, do you talk with planners and engineers about connecting these zones other than just transit? And I think Eisenhower, which we're looking at right now, right in front of Briarwood Mall, imagine everything being purple or blue, lavender, whatever. This is all pedestrian-friendly, bicycle-friendly, mixed-use corridors, but there's essentially a 4-lane highway with a giant median dividing it all. 40 miles an hour, which cars are going faster than that, 9 out of 10 pedestrians die. So where does that disconnect, or are you guys having that conversation between building these things that are pedestrian-friendly and bicycle-friendly versus the roads that cut through them?
Big questions. I think that our history of both, I think the city's history of non-motorized investment has been, from my perspective, pretty remarkable. In my time with the city, the non-motorized infrastructure, bike lanes and the like have been, those prioritizations have been made, and you're starting to see the development of that network in a much more substantial way than it was even 10 years ago, and I think that's pretty remarkable. On the flip side, our investment in public transit has been pretty incremental, and I can tell you from a planner perspective, I sometimes hear about these communities where, some community passes a bond and they put $150 million into a light rail system, and it's always, the growth and the benefits are always exponentially more than what was anticipated. That's a risky proposition, right? And so the approach that we've done here in this community, in our community, has been more incremental, where it's been a bit of a push and pull of, as the demand increased, the service of those routes might increase, the frequency, the span of service. We've expanded the bus service. I think that to that notion of the infrastructure investment and the land use, I think some of this land use probably has to happen to make some of those transportation investments make more viable, so that you could convert Eisenhower to a more transit-oriented. Right now, without the density there of the housing and the like, it's probably just less likely to occur.
Maybe a more pointed question. On Eisenhower, will these buildings end up reducing the 85th percentile speeds on Eisenhower? And how can we design? It sounds like this is a future hypothetical.
Yeah,
This could occur, but
Yeah.
you're not actually talking with planning and engineering about how to make these things happen at the same time.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
So,
Not to
no,
cast
no.
blame at you at all.
No.
I understand these are sideways
No,
sometimes,
I'm
but-
sorry, I don't think I was getting to it. The quick answer is, I think it will. I think that speeds are driven probably more by design and feel than they are by the speed limit signs there. And when we start developing, changing if you were to change the Eisenhower corridor from what it feels now as a very stepped back suburban bermed, it feels very safe to drive that. Once you're talking about buildings that have a taller scale, they're closer to that, they have this pedestrian amenities. For sure, the first one, it's probably going to feel pretty sketchy to be sitting out there in an outdoor cafe. But over time, I do think it has that impact. Now, I think there's probably additional impacts that have to be made then in the actual infrastructure investment of that right-of-way to sort of further that goal. But I think over time, if this physical development happens, it could positively impact that. And just to be clear, these physical developments are a collaborative effort, are reviewed by everybody. So the transportation department that you were seeing maybe more frequently on public infrastructure and capital improvements from the municipal perspective, they're as equally as involved in our development review to make sure it's meeting the goals that we have for these corridors as well.
Thank you.
So we're actually over time, and I'm wondering if you want to continue with the discussion, look at the motion, or discuss this further at our next meeting. Yeah.
It sounds like there's going to be more revisions, is that right? So
I would anticipate.
maybe once there's a closer to final version, that's the point at which we could have a motion to recommend it,
Okay.
have a recommendation. So
We're happy to bring it back to and highlight those changes as well.
I'm seeing lots of head nodding. Have any other pressing questions then before we close off this item? All right. You piqued our interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that will be a future agenda item. All right, so up next is talking about Barton Drive. Need some help with that? Got it. And associated with this is that because it's the removal of some parking spaces, we are actually being requested to have a resolution, which is a slightly different level than before, so.
Good evening. My name is Jane Allen. I'm an engineer with the City of Ann Arbor, and I am the project manager for the Barton Water Main Replacement and Resurfacing Project. The limits for this project are from M14 to Pontiac Trail, plus the intersection at Barton and Starbuck. The water main will be replaced from Northside Avenue to Pontiac Trail, and will be resurfacing the entire corridor. But in the meantime, we were going to introduce some other considerations. Our primary considerations were the water main, the resurfacing, new curb and gutter for drainage if possible, and the reconfiguration of Chandler intersection. That is because we've gotten a lot of complaints from people that people speed through there. The crosswalk doesn't exist. And then some other considerations we were considering were other intersection alterations, new sidewalks, new crosswalks, and new bike lanes. You have in front of you a hard copy of some of the polling results that we took from either the public meeting that we had with the neighborhood and the stakeholders, or online at A2 Open City Hall. I'm just going to summarize some of that now. So we were asking people to pick two of their most important interests in this project of 6 items. They were construction impacts, the water main installation and transfers, other, and then active transportation features, intersection alterations, and financial impacts to residents as far as new infrastructure, such as curb and gutter and sidewalk. Of the people attending the meeting, 62.5% were interested in active transportation features, and 43.8% were interested in intersection changes, while 25% were interested in the financial impacts. The online survey, which included 209 people, 133 were from that ward. Of that 133, 67 was in that neighborhood, and 14 were actually abutting the sidewalks. Their answers were 83.7% interest in active transportation, 41% intersection changes and 10% financial impacts. So as far as the intersection improvements, why would we improve those? We want to improve the safety, the visibility to the traveling public, reduce the speeds, and reduce the paved surface to decrease the impervious area. The first intersection is at Chandler and Barton. Currently, you can sort of see through the aerial there, but at each intersection of the sidewalk, that's where the current curb line is. So people take that intersection very fast. This way, the intersection becomes more perpendicular to the road, sight distance is better, and the crosswalk for pedestrians is shorter, and so they are in the road for a shorter amount of time where vehicles would be. At the Barton and Starwick intersection, this was introduced to us during the Safe Routes to School project. We heard that when we wanted to install a sidewalk here, that they said that the intersection was very unsafe, that there were some runoffs onto people's property. So although we weren't going to install this feature of improving the intersection with the Safe Routes to School, we promised that we would do it with this project. So we are proposing to make this change here, and we would also like to install the sidewalks. You see it also makes the intersection more perpendicular to Barton. It makes the crosswalk shorter. Of course, if the sidewalks weren't installed, the crosswalk wouldn't be installed here. At Barton and Pontiac, we were going to just be doing a resurfacing for this project, not a reconstruct. So we weren't really going to be changing the footprint of this area. There's also the Lower Town study that may reflect changes in the future to this intersection. So we had some feedback on do nothing at this intersection, add a designated left turn lane that you see there with advisory bike lanes. Those bike lanes there would share the vehicle lane, but a vehicle would see there's a bike in the bike lane, and they would be behind the bike. They would give the bike the right of way to that lane. Or the other option would be to keep just 2 lanes, and then we would have a full bike lane up to the intersection. And that would be the same as what's across the street on the east side of Pontiac Trail. The polls that were taken about this designated left turn lane of the public meeting, there was about 59% in favor, and of the online survey, about 76%. At Barton and Breed and Barton and Longshore, all we're intending to do was to also make those intersections narrower, more perpendicular to the intersection. And for Longshore there, when we have a sidewalk on both sides, we will install a crosswalk. Currently, the sidewalk at Breed doesn't have a receiving ramp, so we wouldn't install a crosswalk there. And then at Barton and Northside, we would not be changing the curb line of the north side. It's already perpendicular to the road and narrow enough, but we do propose to put in a crosswalk if we install the sidewalks. We'd be able to put in a crosswalk crossing Northside and also crossing Barton. On to bike lanes. Why would we install bike lanes? Well, to improve safety for both the bike cyclists and for the traveling public and the drivers on that corridor. We would provide a continuous user experience, and we would encourage active transportation and improve community health, and we would also provide more transportation options. If you have a bike lane, more people are willing to use their bikes. Some people don't feel comfortable riding in a shared bike lane with cars, so this would give them their own space, and they may make more options. This bike lane corridor was in the non-motorized plan, and it doesn't indicate in the non-motorized plan whether they would be in the road or have their own bike lane. So we propose to have the blue area there to be proposed in a new paved shoulder. That area currently doesn't have curb and gutter. In the yellow area, that has curb and gutter and also on-street parking at the moment. Therefore, there is a resolution for you to discuss tonight. If you would like more time for feedback, there's all the feedback from the discussions that we've got, emails, and from the public meeting that's on the website, which will give you the address at the end of this presentation. But if we were to remove parking on a block, then that takes city council approval. So your resolution would be to recommend or not recommend them to pass that resolution. As far as the polling goes, when polled about the bike lanes versus parking, at the public meeting, 56% people wanted 2 lanes, and 37% wanted to remain parking, and 6% wanted 1 bike lane and 1 lane left as parking. It was divided equally between which way the bikes would be traveling. On the online survey, 75% of the people wanted 2 lanes, 2 bike lanes, 13% wanted to retain the parking, and 11% wanted 1 bike lane and 1 parking lane. Why to install sidewalks? For the same reasons we would install bike lanes. We want to encourage active transportation. We want to have continuous user experience, more transportation options, improve the safety. So this is where the current sidewalk system is. You can see in that lime green, that's where the sidewalks exist. All the red is where there's a gap. In the non-transportation plan, the entire length of Barton on the north side from M14 to Starwook was recommended. So we have proposed 4 zones that we brought up for different reasons to the public at the public meeting. Zone 1 in blue there was originally in this project scope through the capital improvement plan. It had a high prioritization rate. Zone 2 in the pink there, we got a petition before we started engaging with the public that they would like a sidewalk. And in that area there is where houses front Barton. And then Zone 3 is where the Safe Routes to School sidewalks were, which didn't get passed. So with the intersection reconfiguration, we'd like to also install sidewalks. Then staff thought if we were going to install Zone 2 and Zone 1, we would like to connect those through Zone 4. Of course, that wouldn't go in if Zone 2 wouldn't go in, and we would only consider this if it's technically feasible. We have gotten a petition, and everyone in that zone that they do not want the sidewalk, but it's back lots, so it would be up to staff and the administration to decide if, regarding the impacts to trees, the feasibility, whether we would include that in this project. Based on the polling, these will be a combined percentage of neutral, in favor, and strongly in favor. Zone 1 at the public meeting had an 87% in favor, which is online it was 91%. Zone 2 had 37% in favor or neutral, and then 86% on the online survey. Zone 3 at Starwook had 88% approval at the public hearing, and on the online survey, 90%. And then Zone 4 at the public meeting had 43% neutral or in favor, and online, 86%. So if the crosswalks are, if the sidewalks are installed, we can put crosswalks crossing Barton. You can see here, the blue lines, we would put one at Starwook if the sidewalks are installed. We would put one crossing Barton at Chandler and at Northside. We'd be able to put one crossing Northside. And of course, without any changes to the sidewalks, we will put one in at Chandler when we do that reconfiguration. We would also want to connect the sidewalk, if installed, to the boardwalk. There's discussion, this Monday, we met with the neighbors in that Zone 2, and we looked at the areas where we could do the crosswalk. We want to have it at the 3-way stop where cars are stopping already. There is some sight distance on the east side of the 3-way stop, so crossing M14's ramp, and then also crossing on the west side of the intersection was discussed, but that's still going to be decided through design and also approval through MDOT if we have to use their right-of-way. These crosswalks on Barton would be standard plus, as opposed to standard or high risk. These are some of the fixtures that may be involved signing along that corridor. Also, as Clark said earlier, we would have contrast lighting, positive contrast lighting, and we would install street lights at each of these crosswalks if they go in. And then, as far as the anticipated project schedule, we will be selecting a contractor in March. Hopefully, City Council will approve the contract in May. We will do June to September construction to try to limit the detour route while school's out of session. And as I said, the project website's right there, so you can go and look at the feedback from our engagement so far. Are there any questions?
I had a question about the sidewalk in front of 821 Barton. That was early on. It looks like the sidewalk is quite close to the street, and I know that there's an evergreen, probably a spruce tree in that area, and is that so that the sidewalk is going to go around that tree, or?
During the design for the Safe Routes to School, that sidewalk was proposed, and I had come up with a pay item to trim the spruce tree just so about 8 feet, so people could walk underneath, and we wouldn't have to remove the tree.
Oh, okay, but the tree is in the right-of-way?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm just concerned about having the sidewalk go close to the street because there is a lot of speeding, and I think that's a high crash area. And-
Well, when we reconfigure this intersection here and make the geometry more
Right.
round, we believe people will slow down. There will not be people coming off the road as they do now. You can see the sidewalk is off the road as we typically do, about 3 feet behind the curb at its least amount, and it's wider, further back, right around the intersection.
Okay, I'm a master gardener, but when people break the law and plant trees like this in the right-of-way, I think they need to be removed, and safety needs to be a priority, and these, this tree probably isn't going to have a life expectancy of more than about 50 years, so anyway.
Well, at the time we did the Safe Routes to School design, there was a different forestry manager, so of course we will be discussing this with the new forestry manager.
Oh, okay. I mean, it just contributes to more people breaking the law, and then when we put sidewalks in, we've got that problem. And then I wondered, the crosswalks that you're putting in, they're going to be marked crosswalks. Can you talk about crosswalks?
Yes.
And will they have positive contrast lighting?
Yes.
Okay. And will any of them have RFBs?
No, not currently.
Oh, okay. And do any of them meet the standards for RRFBs if you said they were plus something?
They were standard plus, but
Oh,
we did run the
okay.
analysis and they do not meet the need for RFPs.
Okay, thanks.
So Ray, I think, and then,
Me?
okay.
So I think this is a quick question. What's the speed limit along that?
35.
35, and what are the prevailing speeds?
We are doing an ADT currently to make that up.
Yeah, I'm just worried about the sharrows at that speed.
We are not proposing sharrows.
Okay,
We are proposing to put bike lanes where the current parking lanes are, or in a new paved shoulder.
but I thought there was maybe I'm not using the right term, the shared,
The advisory bike lanes?
The advisory
Is that what
bike
you're
lanes.
thinking of?
The advisory bike lanes, as I explained, is a new type of marking, which many people in Ann Arbor don't understand yet, but what you're allowed to do, the biker stays in their lane, the car can occupy that space if a biker's not present, otherwise they're to stay behind the biker.
yeah, but the key part maybe is that most people in Ann Arbor don't know how to interpret that.
We'll try to do the education with this project, with the neighbors in the area, and it will take that into consideration, how we're gonna get that word out.
I'm wondering, was,
Yeah, just the turn lane, and the rest of the corridor, it's in its own lane.
Oh, so it's just the turn lane.
Yeah, and we could always do this intersection without installing that turn lane, and therefore it'd only be one lane going in each direction, and then the bike lane would be all by itself.
yeah, did they poll on any of those different options and stuff? Or is it because, like, the advisory bike lanes versus full bike lanes and no turn
Well,
lane?
let me
or-
pull that up.
Because I didn't see it in the paper here. I thought,
As far as this intersection went, we did, ask the question, should we leave it as is? Should we, put in the designated left turn lane, or should it be other? At the time, we didn't explain what the other would be, but the other could be 2 lanes and 2 bike lanes, and it would look just like it does across the street. And those results are online. That is bringing up. Any other questions while she's doing that?
Just a quick, we're busy with the computer, so I can't pull up the
Oh.
graphic. But I will say that I think the advisory bike lanes on 7th and in other places are working really well. And so near this intersection, I don't anticipate that being too much of a problem. And I like us going that direction as a default when these sort of conflicts arise. My specific question is the section between Longshore and Chandler when you're heading east up
Yep.
Barton, and specifically bicycle and pedestrian use. Right now, existing, there's that shared path with the board that comes out of the boardwalk that's really nice.
Yeah.
But you have to get up to Chandler in order to cut through the neighborhood on a bicycle or a pedestrian. And I think there's still just gonna be a 4-foot sidewalk there, but
We
there's
do
gonna
plan to
be.
keep a 5-foot sidewalk there, but the bike lane will then pick up on the street.
Is there a way, I hope this is a small tweak, I assume it is. Other places where there's like roundabouts and there's mixed use, there's a path that goes to a bike lane, there's actually like a diversion channel. I'm thinking up on Green.
Nixon.
Nixon, yeah, right, where you're bicycling and it's really clear, oh yeah, you just zip in here into your bike lane and cars and bikes know where people are going. As it is right now, you sort of have to go into Chandler and then what do I do? Do I cross the street? Do I get off my bike?
Okay.
Just a small,
Yeah, I think the design team can probably incorporate the crosswalk markings as well as a diversion marking to get to
Yeah.
the on-street bike lane.
I think anything that makes it easier for bicyclists to just, they don't even have to think, it's just, oh yeah, this is.
They would
obvious
have to
how
make the
go.
transition in the Longshore
Right,
Road, yes.
right,
Yeah.
cool, thank you.
So here we have, there was 18% of that Pontiac intersection that voted for neither when we talked about the possibility. Any other questions?
Can you clarify which aspects of this we're voting on
Well,
tonight?
if you would want to have any of that parking removed to install a bike lane, because the parking's being removed on more than one block, city council has to approve that. So your resolution is to either recommend or not, and it would be a recommendation to city council that would help them make their vote.
But of all of the things we've seen tonight, that's the only piece that we're voting on?
Correct, yes. The
Thank
rest
you.
was just to inform you.
Great, it all looks great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to get this to work. Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Living relatively close to the Barton neighborhood, I definitely think we need to improve pedestrian and bicyclist safety. I am interested in sort of like the complete streets. I know that we're not voting on that particular part tonight, but as far as the cost, I have this paper in front of me about fair share. Is that related to what we're talking about right now?
That is the paper that we gave to everyone who is an affected sidewalk gap property owner. So we want to be transparent on how we go about the special assessments. There is a long process. There's 4 resolutions that city council has to approve before there's an assessment made. And it's currently in the city code, the property owner has to pay for that sidewalk. Sometimes we have projects that have federal funding that can offset the construction costs a little bit, but this project does not. So there is considerable cost. We don't know that cost per lot at this moment. In January, we are going to have the administrative hearing with all affected property owners on the sidewalks we decide to include in this project. And then we will talk about the process, and everyone was given the opportunity to take this pamphlet with them when we had the public meeting.
Okay, yeah, that was my second question, what your funding streams were. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for the objections to the sidewalks, do you have like, did you get a sense of why they were objecting? Was it the special assessments or was it something else?
Yeah, I believe quite a bit of it is the special assessment. And you can see by some of the first question of the polls was, what were you interested in this project? And at the public meeting, it was quite a bit of the financial impacts. So, but we did hear a lot about the Hillsdale area that everyone sent a petition in already saying they don't want it. We heard they didn't want to lose vegetation and privacy. They didn't want to maintain the sidewalk during the winter because currently there's no sidewalk in front of their house or along Breed. So they would have to walk in the street to get to their property because apparently they can't walk through their property. It's very steep to shovel. So we did look into having the city maintain those back lots, and I think that is what's going to happen if that piece gets built. And we are also looking at the vegetation impacts at this moment, and staff and administration are going to discuss the merits of installing that section.
You're talking maintain, like meaning for snow removal?
Yeah, snow removal, yes. Because,
Okay.
yeah,
Because I know there's the sidewalk millage, it's just supposed to maintain the sidewalks, but,
yeah, for repairs, the city
Yeah.
will maintain for any repairs, but for the maintenance of snow removal in the winter, yes, property owners would be responsible, generally, yes.
Any other comments on this, or we should move to the resolution? The suggested resolution is, the commission recommends that on-street parking on both the westbound toward M14 and the eastbound towards Plymouth sides of Barton Drive between M14 and Pontiac Trail be removed to accommodate the installation of a bike lane and of bike lanes, and the recommendation forwarded to City Council for consideration.
There is the opportunity to approve bike lanes on just one side, the way it is written. Sorry, I don't know if that was clear.
Okay.
So both or one or the other, or neither.
Right, so is anybody interested in moving this
I'll move for both.
for both sides? Okay.
I'll second.
Any discussion about that? If you remember, one of our successes was doing this on Pauline Boulevard, so, yeah.
One of the things that I was told, and I'm just wondering if engineering backs this up, is that when you take on-street parking out, the speed on the street increases. And one of the people who lives on Barton tells me that he parks his car in the road just to slow down the street. Oh, okay, yes. I wonder if that's backed up by facts.
I don't know about that myself. We could investigate it with our transportation department, but the lanes themselves will still be 10 feet. If they're wider now, we will make them 10 feet. And then if we have room, then with the bike lane, we will put in 2 lines. So the traveling lane will still have a narrow lane, which will give them the keys to keep a slow pace, I believe.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I can just speak to that, maybe just because there's also a resident in the area. Generally speaking, from my understanding, yes, when you remove parking, it tends to increase speeds if the roadway increases, but there has to be a high density of parking to make that happen, right? You can't just have one car out of the blue and expect the entire corridor to slow down. In my experience, you might be able to concur, there's usually 1 or 2 cars, one of them apparently is yours, that's along that stretch. To be honest, I didn't even realize when I was looking at the maps today that there is on-street parking. It just looks like this is just a single travel lane. So I think adding in striping is actually going to slow traffic down, or we could just put in a whole bunch of cars, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, and if I could maybe piggyback on that as well, I think kind of flipping the statement on the inverse, that parking can provide a traffic calming effect is absolutely true. I think removal of parking in and of itself does not necessarily equate to increased speeds, to the point that Commissioner Parsons was bringing up. If you have other factors that are addressing it, narrowing of lanes, bike lanes, some of the gateway treatments might be part of the crosswalk. So there are other elements that could, still achieve the same traffic calming effect as the on-street parking. So, there's kind of that effect.
I tend to agree with that. Any other? So shall we vote? Okay, so we have the motion before us to remove parking on both sides. And that will be suggested to City Council. So all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, with one abstention, the motion carries. Thank you very much. All right. So next up on the agenda is information and discussion. And we're talking about the changing in the sidewalk gap criteria and weighted recommendations with Nick.
Hi, my name is Nick Hutchinson. I'm the city engineer. And I'm here to talk about how we prioritize the filling of sidewalk gaps in the city. And I'm going to go through this presentation with a little bit of past, present, and future timeline kind of theme here. So just to start with a little bit of background, while I anticipate that the need to fill sidewalk gaps around the city certainly predates this, the first place that I know of that it was really formalized was in the city's original non-motorized plan, and it was captured in there, and that is later on became also consistent with the city's approach with complete streets. Following the non-motorized plan, there was actually a placeholder project that was put in the capital improvements plan. That kind of sat there for a while. It didn't have a lot of forward momentum immediately. And a lot of that was because that there were several challenges to moving it forward. Looking at some of those challenges, the first is something that Jane mentioned actually in her presentation, in that city code requires first-time improvements to be specially assessed to adjacent property owners. So that is obviously a financial burden on the adjacent property owners. So that's an obstacle to get around. In addition to that is funding source. While there are special assessments, those don't get paid back immediately, so the city also needs a funding source to front the design and construction of those projects. So it took a while to work on some solutions to these things, but some at least partial solutions were eventually identified. Sorry, I gotta turn that so I can see it. First of all is using some of our federal funds that we get on an annual basis to help offset the costs of those assessments to some degree. Those funds can't offset all of the costs because of the way they're structured, but it does reduce the cost of those assessments to residents. The second is in 2011, when the street bridge and sidewalk millage was up for approval by voters, that was modified such that could be a funding source to front the cost of the construction until it is eventually paid back by special assessment. So with some of those barriers at least partially removed, the next step was where do we go from here? What do we do first? And that led to us to, we really need some kind of system to prioritize our sidewalk gaps. And so just to give you an idea of the scope of the issue here, we have approximately 430 miles of existing sidewalk. That's actually right now. And about 148 miles of gaps. And the way we're defining a gap in the sidewalks is any place parallel to an existing public road where there are no sidewalks. And just as a very high-level estimate, we crunched some numbers and figured that the estimated cost to fill all of those gaps in the city would be somewhere in the range of $150 to $220 million. That range might even be low. I'm not entirely sure, but obviously it's a high number. So the city, the various city staff formed a working group to work on this prioritization effort for where do we start on this task. And originally, that effort was combined into the budget for the Pedestrian Safety and Asset Access Task Force. It was a fairly limited slice of budget that we had to do that effort. And for that reason, and also for limits that we had in available staff time to work on it, we tried to select criteria for this prioritization that could be fairly easily automated. And when I say automated, I mean by using information that was already available to us in our Geographical Information System, or GIS, which fortunately does have a lot of information in it. So we were able to come up with a lot of criteria that we already had data for. So in the packet that came with this, there is a full listing of what the criteria was that we came up with back then. It was a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And just to give kind of a quick summary of the highlights of what some of these criteria are that we came up with. First of all, proximity to pedestrian attractors, and that actually shows up as several different criteria on this sheet. And those attractors being things like access to transit, schools, parks, affordable housing, things like that. Road classification was another one. The idea being that it's less safe to walk along the side of a major street with high volumes of traffic and maybe higher speeds than it is on a low volume residential street. Requests was another important one. That's for citizen requests. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future as I get through this. The non-motorized plan, if a specific sidewalk gap was called out specifically in the non-motorized plan, it got points for that. Gap length was another one. We had kind of some back and forth on that one, but the idea behind that being that maybe a very short gap is maybe a little bit more annoying than a whole neighborhood that doesn't have sidewalks at all. And then city-owned parcels was another one. That we kind of internally called that the shame on you factor. If there's a gap adjacent to a city-owned parcel, it got more points for that. The vast majority of those parcels tend to be actually parks. And then finally, pedestrian automobile incidents or pedestrian automobile crashes as a factor as well. Let's see. So with establishing those criteria, and as you can see on that sheet, that full sheet, we came up with scoring criteria for all of that. And that was modeled very much after the same framework that we use for our capital improvement plan itself. It's basically the same scoring and weighting process that we use for the capital improvement plan. And we use that for a lot of prioritization type activities that we do. So after setting that, the criteria and the scoring for them, we had to weight those criteria as well with the thought that not every one of these is of equal importance. So the staff group did a weighting exercise, and you'll see those weights written in this sheet as well. They're relative to each other, so they don't add up to 100 or anything like that. But you can see based on that how the importance that they were given. So once that was done, we ran it through our GIS, came up with scores for a lot of different things, and then we used that well, first of all, to create a map, which is also included in your package here. It's kind of a heat map of where the highest priorities are, with the higher priorities being more red and the lower priorities being more towards the blue. We used all of that information to start creating projects in our capital improvement plan, and a lot of those have actually been, no, I shouldn't say a lot of them, several of them have been built since that time. Eventually this whole prioritization system was presented to the Pedestrian Safety and Access Task Force, and was actually incorporated into their recommendations from that group. So so we've been operating under that prioritization system for the last few years, but now that we have been using that for a few times, and we've been for a few years and have been implementing some of these projects, we've gotten some feedback from various sources, from residents, as we've done that. And some of that recent experience has, led us to a desire to maybe tweak some of these criteria and update some of the criteria, which is the effort that we're working on right now, and what I'm kind of bringing to you today for, to get feedback on. The goal behind doing that is to incorporate some of that feedback, and ultimately we want to create some more successful projects too. We want to be able to work on and advance the projects that we think have the best chances of moving forward. So in this prioritization update, we're proposing some modifications to some of the criteria. We updated and tweaked some wording and things like that. The last attachment is also in your package here, that shows the new tweaks to those criteria. I just want to note too that I realized just this afternoon, and it was too late to change it, that the weights shown on that proposed prioritization 2.0 attachment are wrong on that sheet. I'll have a slide in a minute to show the comparison between the old and the new, but just wanted to make sure that you knew that those need to be corrected. But just some of the highlights to what we're proposing to change. First of all, we changed the citizen request category to something that we call evidence of community support. And that, a couple of factors that we changed on that with the scoring. First of all, on the previous prioritization scoring, if one person requested a sidewalk gap to be filled, or 100 people requested a sidewalk gap to be filled, they got the same number of points. So we wanted to change that to show if people wanted to bring forward a petition and showed a large amount of support, that it would get more points the more support that it showed. So the scoring reflects that. The other piece of that is, in terms of that evidence of community support, is the physical evidence. And the picture that you see here on the screen is an example of that, where there's an obvious, what we call goat path, where people are clearly using that space right now, and there's some strong evidence in this case that you can see that there's a clear need for a sidewalk there, and maybe a more urgent need than some other places. So points would be awarded for that. The second thing is one piece of feedback we got from a couple of residents during the course of some of our projects was that we should prioritize roads where there's no sidewalk on either side over roads where there's already a sidewalk on one side. So we did work that into the classification of adjacent road criteria by adding changing the point scoring such that it would get a little bit more points if there's no sidewalk out there at all existing. And then the final thing was the pedestrian and auto crashes. That was, in the original weighting, that was actually weighted relatively low. And the reason that it was weighted relatively low is that we didn't feel like we had very good data on that. We do have data on pedestrian and auto crashes, certainly, but the trick that we felt was that teasing out whether those crashes had anything to do with the lack of a sidewalk or not. And so in the proposed change that we had to this, we're actually adding in a little bit of more of a manual review by traffic engineers to look at the crash data where we do have pedestrian auto crashes around a sidewalk gap and see if there is, any kind of evidence that would be related to the lack of a sidewalk. Or if it was somebody crossing the street, for example, that isn't necessarily related to a gap. So we changed the scoring criteria for that a little bit to reflect that, and we changed the weight on that as well, as you'll see here in just a minute. So this is a comparison of what's called final weights on here is our proposed weights for the criteria versus what they were previously. And as you can see, the evidence for community support moved up to the top right next to the proximity to schools, which was, so they're kind of right there neck and neck. And then the pedestrian auto crashes, now that we feel like our data is going to be better, that moved up quite a bit. That would be the main summary I would give in terms of, how the weighting of those criteria changed from before. I think the reason the evidence of community support moved up is because we have so many needs in the system. We want to be able to select projects that we feel are going to have a lot of support and they're going to be successful moving forward. So next steps on this, we're in the feedback stage right now, starting right here tonight. We want to get the commission's feedback on this, certainly. Then after tonight, we'll talk a little bit more internally about feedback, seeking feedback from council and other sources as well. And then ultimately moving forward from there, we need to update our model. As I mentioned, we did add some aspects here that are going to require a little bit more manual effort. That is, having a transportation engineer review the crashes, and also we're going to have probably an intern job reviewing the aerial photos for the evidence of the GO paths. Some of them we know where they are, but we want to look to see if we can find those. If you can see them from the aerials, then they're usually fairly clear. And then we will rerun the model in our GIS and update that map. And as we did last time, about approximately a year from now, when the next full CIP is being put together, we would use that updated model to generate our project suggestions in the capital improvement plan. So, with that, any questions?
I have a couple, so I could start. It seems like there's two criteria that were left out from the Pedestrian Safety and Access Task Force. And one of those is that we also mentioned, I think, hospitals, clinics, and places that especially would serve disabled people. So that would be under the other, but the other ones were represented by what we had said, I believe. And also, I think that at some point, when we brought it up here, we included stairs as a sidewalk gap, and that seems to have disappeared.
Like stairs that are in the right of way in the sidewalk system.
That are part of the sidewalk.
Yeah, we didn't include. I don't remember that being included as part of the sidewalk gap discussion per se. That was I think was a separate discussion that we had, and we have started to look into that. We had a couple of projects actually that we did in the last couple of years that have specifically targeted removing stairs in the right of way in the sidewalk system itself. I'll have to take another look at where that is right now. I think we did an inventory, and we're working towards eliminating those separately from filling gaps in the system.
Okay, well, I thought we had said that it should be considered as a gap, but I might be wrong.
I don't recall that.
And then I have general comment, which is that in reading some of the social media posts that people have been making about sidewalk gaps, there's been a general statement of, well, who knew that they were going to have to be assessed? And, you know, I know that when we moved back to Ann Arbor in 1971, and I was in going into junior high school at that time, I knew certainly that we had a property that had hundreds of feet of non-sidewalk area, and it was always, well, at some point, there's going to be a huge assessment, and we'll be really stuck with this, and it's going to cost a fortune. And that was in '71, and it was quite obvious, and so I find it disingenuous that people don't know that they're at some point going to be required to help pay for a sidewalk. So I just had that general comment. And I think also that the importance of, it's helpful to look at the importance of sidewalks versus vegetation. And I would originally have come down on the side of vegetation back when I was walking, especially out in Lakewood subdivision where there's all kinds of sidewalk gaps. But I was young and able to jump out of the way of cars. And at this point, not having a sidewalk, particularly if I'm using a wheelchair, is a huge detriment, and it's completely impossible in the winter. And so this is very much a disability issue. And I think that should also be at the forefront, that we need those sidewalks so that people can maintain their ability to get around. And that ability, I think at this point, does trump a lot of the vegetative issues and concerns. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Thanks, Nick, for the presentation, very much. I'm really happy to see that goat paths are included. I'm going to talk about the name of it, though, because I'm not happy with that. I'm curious about the community support element and how goat paths versus calls for requests for sidewalks, how those are weighted, because that wasn't made clear. It's just all a high number. And for me, evidence of community support, like it could either be a fix-it ticket, click, or a goat path. Those goat paths, especially that one on Fuller you just showed, there are literally hundreds of people traveling there every day. Like, you can't make that sort of thing, right? I think we can interpret that that's a highly desired area for a sidewalk. The other thing just to mention about goat paths is that other planners call them desire lines, which indicates, for me anyway, it seems semantic, but these are rational human beings who are noting a lack in infrastructure as opposed to animals that aren't following their herding directions. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I very much prefer desire lines. You know what I mean? Like it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's
Yeah,
semantic.
I get what you're saying. I don't know that we put that much thought into the wording, but
Sure.
we'll consider that certainly.
Cool.
In terms of your comment or question about the weighting, I think the slide that's up on the screen right now, the weighting system that we use, this is the same weighting system we use for the capital improvement plan, and it's a little bit hard to explain. And I don't know that I can actually do it. All that I can say is that those are the relative weights from one to another. So when you look at Evans Community Sport being, the top one gets 100, and then the rest below that are proportionally ranked based on the weighting exercise that we do among the work group that they came up with it. So I can't explain it any better than that, unfortunately. But it's, like I said, it's all relative to each other. So you can see that the one at the bottom, which is gap length, is approximately a third of the weight of the Evidence Community Sport, which is at the top.
Well, and it sounds like you folks are going to be proactive in looking for these goat paths or desire lines.
Correct, yeah.
And so once one is noticed, then it just enters the queue with high-level support, like somebody doesn't have to contact and request.
No,
It's-
right,
it's
right, correct. It
essentially
would,
the
yeah,
city.
it would be in lieu of somebody calling or requesting it. Now, there's a good chance that we might miss some, and somebody calls in and say, hey,
Sure.
could you fill this? And we look at it and say, oh,
Sure.
hey, go path there, it gets, automatically gets the points for that.
No, I very much appreciate the proactive approach.
Sure.
Very much.
Yeah.
The intern that has to do it might not.
Hi, yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when I did see a map, I think I had a map in my packet of the complete streets. I overlaid a map of the Ann Arbor School District. And so the Ann Arbor School District kind of extends outward from the boundaries that I saw on the map. So in the vein of safe routes to school, I'm wondering if you're doing any collaboration with neighboring townships or cities to improve the safety for students who may be walking or bicycling to school. I have talked to quite a few families who live east of the city of Ann Arbor, Gettys or Plymouth Road, who feel like it's not safe for their kids to ride bikes, say, to Huron High School or whatever school their kids are attending. So I just wanted to see if you were proactive about collaboration.
That's a good question. There have been some places where various levels of collaboration have happened. I know that some of the pinch points that we often encounter where we abut the county/townships are at the highway overpasses, which are controlled by the state. So you're really getting multiple jurisdictions into that as well. I know there've been some discussion, the one I can think of most recently is at Plymouth Road and US 23, that there's been some discussion with MDOT and the township out there about trying to make a connection through there, and I'm not sure what the status of that is offhand. So I would say those things come as the opportunities arise. Certainly, there have been times in the past, long before I was here, that there's been efforts to make such things happen with MDOT support. One that I can think of off the top of my head is the Scioto Church Road over I-94, where there is a pedestrian walkway that's kind of hung over the side of the bridge that allows access from that neighborhood over to Oak Valley Drive, to the sidewalk and the Ice Cube and the library, or the sidewalk, the library and the Ice Cube and places like that. So I believe there's one on Liberty as well. Stone School Road over on 94. So there's been a history of those things happening, and we'll continue to seek opportunities like that in the future. Unfortunately, some of those places where we connect to the county are some of the most difficult places to put in sidewalks. One of the example you mentioned, Gettys. Gettys Road is a fine example of that. There are a lot of huge technical challenges, and a very expensive project would have to be done in order to be able to install sidewalks or frankly even bike lanes out there. So.
Thank you.
I'm also curious about an aspect of the evidence of community support. So I'm wondering, and maybe the way this manages it is by not addressing it, but there are moments where there's both strong community support for a sidewalk and some amount of opposition, and it's the same sidewalk. And I'm wondering if those get addressed or balanced in any way, or how. I'm still thinking about the recent Safe Routes to School project that was a huge missed opportunity when it was voted down, I think because the opposition was very vocal. And I'm wondering how we do better at that in the future.
Yeah, so part of what we're trying to change is to address that exactly, and to try to help prioritize projects where we know there is going to be a lot of support. So that is part of the goal of changing that criteria. In putting together these criteria for prioritization, very rarely at that point are we hearing opposition. We're mostly hearing requests that people want to put it in. So it's kind of hard to weigh opposition at that point for the, however everybody said, 148 miles of sidewalk gaps we got throughout the city. We can't go out and poll everybody to find out where there's opposition, for example. So, trying to reward a higher level of support, encouraging people that really want them to go out, talk to their neighbors, get petitions signed, build some community support for it in advance, and give those projects credit for it, and then try to advance those projects. Not to say we don't want to advance other projects as well, but to reward those types of efforts by giving more points to those.
Great, and I think that that's a great plan, but I worry that then locations where there's perhaps a high need and also some level of opposition are going to just be sidewalkless forever.
We do the best we can. Once we create a project, we do a lot of community engagement. We have a lot of discussions. Ultimately, those special assessment districts have to be approved by city council. So the decision is ultimately in their hands. The most we can do is provide them with the information that we've received from the public engagement process, and let them make that determination.
And if I could just add a little specificity to that too, in the big matrix that is included in your packet, if you look at 6 for evidence of community support, you'll kind of see that array that's identified. So a single request, just from a single individual, will get you some points. And then it kind of ratchets up. If you have a signed petition by 25 to almost 50% of those who are affected, then you get 5 points. If you have 50 to 75%, you get 8 points. And if you have over 75% who signed a petition saying they want sidewalk, then you get the full 10 points. And so the idea is, this is a matrix of multiple things for consideration. For this one, even a single person can influence and award points, but we also are trying to capture kind of this spectrum of support throughout, the affected area and trying to gauge it for this criteria in and of itself to try to capture the sentiment of how well it would be supported by the community.
And another piece that's in that whole scoring is points for if that request comes from barrier-free community. For example, we had a project a couple of years ago that was done partially because it got a request from the Disabilities Commission, for example.
This is probably outside the scope of this conversation, but is the city talking about alternative ways to fund sidewalk apps?
I'm going to let Howard answer that.
A couple weeks ago, I sent a rather lengthy memorandum to council called Sidewalk Strategies, and it explored really 2 main issues. One was the change in longstanding practice and policy that new sidewalks are assessed against the property owner as a property improvement, and that is a matter of policy the council has to address. The second part of that was a comparison to several peer cities as to how they fund sidewalks and identified some potential new funding sources. In all candor, I think, and Northside STEAM was a great example of staff being very dexterous in addressing the non-financial concerns of that design until we got to a point where it really was about the finances. And I'm not minimizing that impact. Our chair just brought that up a little while ago. But that's a fundamental issue for council to decide from a policy standpoint, and then we can talk about other means of finding funds, in addition to the exceptional job staff currently does in finding federal funding.
So we're over time on this item as well, so if there's any other urgent questions or comments, but I assume you'll welcome them
And
as well,
and feel free if
anytime.
anybody thinks of any other comments, after you've had more time to look over this, feel free to send them on to Kayla and she can get them to me.
Appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The next item is scheduled for 15 minutes, which is that we need to have some draft direction as to where, policy, where we're going, and apparently no one responded to the homework request. but we have the policy agenda input. So it may be that we can polish this off in a few minutes. Right now, if you have anything as far as a big policy agenda items, I think I wrote the ones from last year, and we really did want to have a larger input than this time. And we can also postpone this until our next meeting if we want to. Is that right?
Yes, we can postpone this until November. It's due in December, though, so November is the last
Yes.
chance.
So what would you like, Howard?
The development of the policy agenda is still a relatively new phenomenon. The council committee was only formed about 2.5 years ago. And the intent really is to shape how we address our lobbying efforts and our interactions with our state and federal representatives. But it's also a budgetary guidance document, and we have that policy agenda adopted at the same time as the budget. So the reason we're looking for it in December is to help shape the budget retreat with council. I don't think it's overly critical if you want to take some time and debate it and discuss it a little bit more. So there's some wiggle room in there. But it ultimately helps us form the strategies for the financial plan for each year.
My sense is that it would be probably better to take this up in November, and as much advance information that you can provide to Kayla, the better. Any objections to that?
No objections, just I think we should revisit what we wrote last year, because as far as I know, nothing has really changed on the state level from what we offered last year. The other thing I might expand is that there's now a sidewalk ordinance that's at the state level, and we might want to have some policy suggestions on that, including some new language that I heard recently, that on a state level, sidewalks can always be defined, including the ramp leading to the sidewalk as part of the sidewalk.
Do you mean crosswalk?
Or crosswalk, sorry, crosswalk ordinance. My apologies. So if state law changed so that crosswalks included the landing ramps, that might be
That
a
might-
solution to the larger issue.
Yeah, that might be effectively the same as the Ann Arbor ordinance.
So we can include that in a discussion in November.
Yeah, that's great.
That was actually on my
Yeah.
list as well.
I probably
Okay.
won't bring up the thing about MDOT and adding crosswalks and sidewalks and things like that, how they need to make it so that it's easier to do that on those roads that, because we have all this issue like by Weber's and how the Washtenaw and Pittsfield probably took like 10 years to actually get done.
So if you can put these in writing and send them to Kayla, that would be great.
Those will be helpful in routine conversations with MDOT as well. There's an item that's on our agenda now. There's a House bill addressing fines for speeding in school zones too. That's probably taken us, it's one of the first things I touched when I got here, and with Representative Warren's help, she's introduced it, and that's of importance to council members as well.
Okay, so we're going to take this up in November. Little pushing, and you guys have lots of good ideas. So I'll also ask Kayla to remind people, say in about 2 weeks.
We'll remind you, don't worry.
Okay. Rather than at the very end. Great, then we can move on to staff reports and updates. And we have 5 minutes allotted to Ray.
Very good. Madam Chair, commission members, I'll just quickly go through as par for the course, the changes from last month to this month. On the first page, Fifth Avenue, the bricks are being replaced. We had a bad batch of bricks as part of that project. Those are being swapped out. You may have seen that work in front of Carytown. That work should be completed in the coming weeks. Moving ahead, the, let's see, what else I wanted to highlight here. School safety improvements, I think it's worth noting on page 3 that the Tier 3 work has been completed. So again, you may recall that, the school safety improvements were kind of broken up into 3 different tiers of work. All 3 tiers are now done. There is a Tier 4 as well, but a lot of that's just ongoing work. So that's, will always be on our plate. But It's kind of a big accomplishment that, this came out of the Pedestrian Safety Action Task Force, and, we've been reporting on these, and to have kind of checked that off is kind of a big accomplishment for the city. We have taken some projects off the list that have been completed, and, we've reported on them for a couple months that they've been completed. So if you just see, for example, North Maple Road restriping crosswalks, how that's not on the list anymore, it's just because we've been reporting that was completed for a while now. Huron Street improvements. The thing to note here is that work between 5th and Main on the north side of the street, this is page 5, is being deferred to spring 2020. Just has to do with the schedule and, the weather. We're running out of time on the construction season. So the project will be largely complete, but there's going to be kind of a block or so that will be deferred till spring. The DT gas main replacement project is scheduled to finish this week if it hasn't already, but I think with the weather the last couple of days, I wouldn't be surprised if that has delayed some of that final wrap-up work. The William Street project, one thing to make note of, if you haven't marked it on your calendars, there's a public celebration for the project scheduled for October 27th at 2 p.m. This is the kind of big unveiling of the new protected bike lane and cycle track that's going in along William Street. So I know the DDA is excited to invite everybody out there with City Administrator Lazarus and others to kind of celebrate that accomplishment. There's a small update under the road diet section related to Traverwood. This just pretty much highlights the fact that the project is currently under construction. We had Mr. Chinesky kind of mention that earlier and during the public comment, so that project's moving along nicely. The transportation plan update, there is quite a bit of new information. I believe it's on page 9, Nami. Just reported on the advisory committee meetings that happened last month, as well as there was a community input session last night at the Peace Neighborhood Center. We had somewhere between a dozen and 2 dozen people show up. So we solicited some additional feedback. One thing that I'm sure many of you have seen hit the airwaves today is there is an additional survey related to the transportation plan specific to bicycling that went online, I think, yesterday, and we've already gotten several hundred responses on it. So that's gained a lot of traction. We'd love for you all to share that with your respective groups that you are tied into. And I'm sure we'll send that out if we haven't already to all of you to share as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is at the very end of the report, under the Office of Sustainability and Innovations update, there's a note that the Ann Arbor Public Schools won a grant from the state to buy 4 electric buses for their fleet. And so there's the opportunity for some kids to have green commutes on their way to school. So it's kind of exciting. So those are the big highlights I wanted to address from last month to this month. The one thing I will note, the pedestrian safety improvements that we report monthly, because the way Transportation Commission fell and when City Council fell, you don't have those updates this month just because the 3rd Wednesday falls before the 3rd Monday, if that makes sense. It's a little abnormal, but it happens on occasion. So you may have noticed that there weren't any updates. We just like to report those to council or simultaneously with council to you. We were still working on that report at the time of this, so you'll get those next month. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right, then we're making up for lost time. The next item on the agenda was for informational purposes. Although I'm a little bit confused because Councilmember Griswold approached me just before the meeting and said that this was already agreed to by City Council, but it was supposed to come to us next month. So can you shed some light on that?
Sure. The council adopted a resolution that directed the administrator to really do 3 things. The first is to address our staffing and how we're organized to get work done. The second was to consolidate some of the data and reports that we have. Most recently, we sent an annual report to council, which interestingly enough is a charter requirement that's never been done before. That focused on the 262 performance measures that we have. So our goal from the mobility and safety standpoint is to consolidate those along with the work that's being done to give a more comprehensive look at how we're doing. And for life, I can't remember what the third part was.
So, report quarterly.
Now, there's, the one thing that was added to at the time it was adopted was to have the consultant doing the transportation plan, Sam Schwartz, take a look at the biking and cycling culture. And I think it's more looking at how we're organized to accomplish the goals of Vision Zero and Complete Streets. So I think our approach to that will be to find the best organizations that the Schwartz organization looked at and then compare to where we are and then make some recommendations as to where we may need some more resources. So just as background, Councilmember Griswold presented me with a draft. I helped her write it, and I wrote it in a way where there were discrete deliverables that we could all touch and evaluate so that there are some outcomes, there's some support for staff, and also have it be forward-looking so we can see what else we might need to put in the budget. And when we come back to you in future years for a budget discussion, it'll give us a roadmap.
So is this still coming before us in November?
It should. I think the intent is to bring those features back here for discussion before we present them to council.
Okay, and let us know what action we're
I think we'll look for your comments and recommendations to council.
Okay. So it's just a heads up, we don't need to discuss it at this point. Thank you. And then the roster of transportation commissioners.
So the purpose of this item is just to draw attention to the fact that we now have Jim Summers and Deanna Lernahan on the commission, and that we are slowly but steadily filling all the vacancies. We only have one remaining, so we're getting there.
Great. And so if there are ideas, so there may actually be candidates in front of Chris Taylor at this point.
Yes, there is one more opening for a member of the public, just a generic member of the public, as you can see right here.
Okay. And I can pressure him to, request him to fill that vacancy if you would like, if you have any ideas or direction on that, feel free to let me know. That's worked before. Okay. And then we have liaison reports from those who are representing a particular constituency or other commission. A couple of them are missing tonight, but and then we'll have an opportunity for individual commission communications. Okay, so individual commission member communications. I promised that I would come back with some information about the Transportation Advisory Committee. And I think that the notes that were taken from that meeting, which you can get to by the link on the transportation review that Ray gave us just a minute ago, are pretty excellent. And it's a great example of how our little E projects worked out well for that group. They used that by dividing people into those different groups, although I think they consolidated them down to 4. And one of the things that I came home quite struck by was that the enforcement group was incredibly kind and was not saying more police, more tickets, but really talked about inspiring people and enhancing their experience instead of enforcing their experience. And it was really, it's not quite reflected in the notes that way, but it was dominated by this friendly, positive attitude, which was quite refreshing and also pleasant to hear. So our next meeting is not until January, I believe. And it still is a very dynamic, powerful group of people. It's pretty cool, especially at 9 in the morning. Any other reports, commissioners as individuals?
Well, it's more of a comment that I kind of might lead to a future meeting topic. I know that, like, I've been using the bus, and I've noticed, like, since the summer ended, it's just been lots of delays, and I've heard a number of people talk about extreme delays on the AAATA buses, and part of me wonders, yeah, why this is. I know this has got to do with congestion, and that actually is another topic that I feel like could be addressed. I know that some members of council have actually said, well, we need someone who's going to bring up congestion. I think it's a valid topic. Now, I don't necessarily think we should just throw in more lanes or something, but I think it's a valid topic, and I'm kind of curious to see where things have progressed. Has congestion gotten way worse, or do we have more construction going on this time of year, this year, than last year? Because I will say that I've noticed from the buses, I mean, it's bad for drivers, but it's worse for buses because it can result in missed transfers and waiting 20 minutes for a bus that then takes longer than usual, which is more than just getting in the car and taking longer than usual because you got to wait. And I'm kind of curious from both the transit and the overall transportation perspective, that would be both involving AAATA and the city, as far as for AAATA, on-time performance, what problems have they been experiencing, particularly since the summer ended, and how that compares to past years, and also overall the city, are we doing more construction this time of year than we were in past years?
So my suggestion would be that we can request a comment from AAATA. And then if it seems like it's a larger issue, we could put it on the agenda, but
Yeah.
a simple memorandum would probably suffice. Did I see you raise your hand? Yeah.
I cannot comment for AATA, though I do work with them quite closely, but running the university bus system, Tim, what I can tell you is it has been mostly construction related, been huge detours. We've been on detour on all of our bus routes for U of M since the spring, and we will continue to be on detour through this year, through next summer, by the way, for all the different road projects. So it is mostly construction related.
And is it something unusual? Because there's always construction this time of year. It's is it that there's some projects that got delayed and then are just carrying over into the academic year, or?
So if you put together a list of those kinds of questions, then we can.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any more than anecdotal data, just my experiences and other people's experiences.
Which is valid, yeah.
I'd like to see the actual data, where AAATA's on-time performance stats for the last couple months and versus the same months last year. And I'd kind of like to hear where construction fits in, which is where it's more than just a AAATA, it's a city issue.
Okay, so we can follow up with Kayla and see if that's actually an agenda item or just an informational piece. Thanks. Any other comments from commissioners? Okay, then we talk about next agenda items.
So on the work plan for November is bringing back the policy agenda items as well as the T1 zoning district that you heard about today. We also have an Ann Arbor Public Schools project overview and school city coordination update, which will come from Liz Margolis. And we have a U of M parking update from Commissioner Dolan. Would you like to request other topics right now?
I don't know if this is a formal request, but I'm just going to throw it out there that, at least in following the last couple months of discussion about various projects and online and talking to various community members, and sometimes language that's in resolutions, I think that there's some competing interpretations of what Vision Zero entails, or at least a misunderstanding, and that might be on my end, but it seems that we're not all together on the same page of what actually Vision Zero entails. So I was going to suggest perhaps Sam Schwartz Consulting, taking after the resolution that was just passed, that apparently they should be the ones maybe to present on this, come and talk to us about what the basic principles of Vision Zero are, specific goals of Vision Zero, and proven methods to achieve Vision Zero, so we can all get on the same page.
Okay. That has been
Great.
noted.
Yep, we'll touch in with Sam Schwartz, and if they can't present, then we will try to find an equally qualified staff member to do so that's involved on the project.
For the future, probably early next year, I have in mind a request to look at the 7th Street process that's been going on for about 4 or 5 years of the attempt to slow traffic there, and what's been done and what has worked and not worked, and to look really at the process of community input as well as the actual engineering and results of what's going on. I'll admit that I've been a little bit reluctant to follow up because it's so much in my backyard, a project. I didn't want to be influencing it unduly, but I think that would be an interesting exercise to sort of walk through. And it will take some months to prepare the data that we need. But I think we should look at what went right and what went wrong and what still needs to be done there. There's still just a really high level of frustration. But that's not for next month.
Okay.
Any other agenda items? If you come up with any, just let us know, and that would be fine. All right. So our next meeting is November 20th at 7 p.m. Here in the second floor council chambers at Larkham City Hall. And as we get into the holiday times, it becomes especially important to let us know if you are going to miss a meeting, to make sure that we do have quorum. So if you plan to be away, please let us know as soon as possible. So if there is no objection, then I'll call the meeting adjourned. The gavel's missing. Okay.